Hello class, let's talk about scope. In particular, let's talk about variable scope. So scope is defined, or scope refers to the lifetime or accessibility of a variable. So if you want to store data in your program, you need a place to put it, and often that place is a variable. Before we can store data into a variable, we must first declare a variable. Once a variable is declared, we can begin reading and writing data into the variable. So here I have an application where I'm trying to write the data that is stored in some variable x, but notice we get an error. It says x has not been defined in the current context. Before we can use a variable, we have to declare a variable. So let's declare a quick little variable here. So here I've declared an integer variable x, assigned data into it, and now I can print the results. So if we run this little application, we can see that x is 4. Alright, now the scope of x, the lifetime of x, exists from the line in which it is declared, so line 15, all the way until the closed bracket of the code block in which it is declared. So notice that this integer x is declared inside the main method here, the code block of our main method. So this x variable exists from the line in which it is declared until the final code block, the closing code block of the block in which it was declared. So for example, if I try to go before the line in which it is declared and assign data into x, I can't do this because at line 15, x doesn't exist. It only exists from the line in which it is declared until the closing parentheses in which it is declared. So if I go below the line in which the x is declared, I can assign new data into it. I can use x. I can write data into it, read data from it. So if I run this application, we should see that x is now 10. All right. So let's talk about scope and some of the problems we can get into. Because a variable exists only inside the code block in which it is declared, if I go ahead and put an artificial code block around this variable declaration, notice that we start seeing errors here. X inside this code block does not exist anymore. Our variable x now exists from the line in which it is declared until the closing code block, the closing bracket of the code block in which it is declared. X exists inside this code block, but it does not exist outside it. It no longer is alive. It no longer exists. So that's something to be careful of. For example, if we built an if statement, if 1 is less than 2, and I declare some variable inside that if statement code block, notice we cannot access that variable outside of that code block. However, if I declare the variable before the code block and then just use the variable, then we are okay. So the scope of a variable cannot leave the code block in which it is defined, but it can enter all following code blocks until it gets to the end of the code block in which it is defined. Okay? So another place that this can show up is when we build maybe a for loop. So let me put a for loop in here. Here I have a for loop where I'm declaring an integer counter variable inside the parentheses of this for loop syntax. Notice that x is not accessible after the for loop. Well, when you declare a variable inside the parentheses of before a code block, it's the same as declaring it inside the code block. So this integer x only exists inside this for loop code block. So inside here I could say x is equal to 1, and we have access to it. We have no errors here. But outside the code block, x doesn't exist anymore. Now, another thing to be careful of is, let's say I want to declare a variable x that exists outside the code block, and I'm trying to redeclare it inside the code block. Well, I can't do that because x, the error we see here is that x cannot be declared in this scope because that name is already used. So because this variable x can go into following code blocks, we can't redeclare the variable. However, we can reuse the variable. That's no problem. All right. One more example of just basic variable scope. Let's say we create another method here. I'm going to stick some method down here. And I want to use the variable x. Well, because x only exists within the code block it is defined in, then that means that a variable cannot exist outside a method in which it is declared in. So this int x right here on line 15 exists inside the main method code block. Therefore, it cannot be accessible, directly accessible in another method. So another method can redeclare or reuse that variable name. In this example, this integer x is accessed and used inside the main method. This integer x is accessed and used inside this other method. These two variables are completely separate from one another. They are not linked in any way. We're just reusing a name here. Now you can also declare variables inside methods as input parameters. So if I create an int x here, notice that I have access to this input parameter variable, because a variable declared inside the parentheses of a method or an if statement or a for statement before a code block, it's as if it were declared inside the code block. So I hope that helps a little bit when understanding basic scope of a variable.